class in Fisheries and Wildlife 220 Wildlife Management. I'm here today with Mr. Tom Salo to talk about the Franklin Mountain HawkWatch and hawk watching more generally. Tom has served as the co-chair of the Franklin Mountain HawkWatch, so he has detailed knowledge about the history and ecological aspects of this site that make it a special place to observe hawk migration. Tom has also been heavily involved with Appalachian Eagle Project, which I suspect he may mention a bit later in our discussion. Tom, thanks so much for taking the time to meet with me to discuss your experiences with the Franklin Mountain HawkWatch and expertise related to raptors. We'll be using this interview to supplement lab materials related to hawk watching, and our students always enjoy our perspectives and experiences of experts in the field. So thank you, Tom.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So class, what we're gonna do is have a little interview discussion, and Tom is gonna actually answer the questions in more detail for you to understand the hawk watching at Franklin Mountain. So Tom, our first question for you is, can you briefly summarize your past experience with hawk watching and hawk counting? And what are 1 to 2 particularly interesting or high profile raptor projects that you have been involved with, and describe the goals and objectives of these?
Well, my experience with hawk watching goes back to 1989 when Andy Mason started the Franklin Mountain HawkWatch. It was his initiative. And few of us knew much about hawk watching at the time. So I was a beginner, and I would say fairly good bird skills, but not good hawk watching skills. And it was a crash course. We learned quickly. As far as other projects I've been involved with, you mentioned the Appalachian Eagle Project, which has been fascinating. And what that was an Eastern continental effort to map the distribution and demographics of golden eagles in the use traps, putting out usually deer carcasses, sometimes live, and seeing what we started doing that in 2010. We did it for 11 years. We're not continuing that effort, but every year we got golden eagles, and in some places we would get multiple golden eagles. There were some sites in Delaware County that got 7 or 8 golden eagles, different individuals, during the winter before the spring migration started. Plus, we got tons of other stuff. All kinds of scavengers, lots of bald eagles, ravens. A fascinating project. I ran the project for New York, and we have over 1 million photographs from New York, and a lot of data. If we had students who were willing to work with some of that data, a lot of data analysis could be done with that. So that's something that students might think about for an independent project. The other thing that I would say is one of the more interesting efforts is the GPS tagging and trapping of winter resident golden eagles that we have done. We caught 8 golden eagles, and most in Delaware County, 1 in Otsego County. And this came out of the Appalachian Eagle Project. We were getting so many golden eagles, and there's so little known about their habits and their habitat use that we decided to join with some other golden eagle researchers. So the GPS tracking is a massive amount of data from that also, but it helps to find habitat use, home and core ranges, migration paths, and is used to a large degree to help assess wind risk, wind project risk.
Thank you. Next question. Can you briefly summarize your involvement with the Franklin Mountain HawkWatch program? When did the HawkWatch begin at the site, and how was it evolved over the years? And who runs the Franklin Mountain HawkWatch, and who manages the site? Also, who is responsible for counting and reporting hawks at the site?
As I mentioned, Andy Mason was the person who initiated counting there in 1989. And we really didn't know what we were doing. And then the following year, a very experienced hawk watcher who had traveled all over the East named Ron Milligan showed up, and we started learning very rapidly. The learning curve was incredible. We also something we didn't know in 1989 was how to distinguish between migrating and local resident raptors. So we learned a lot about not just hawk identification, but how to run a hawk watch. The protocol developed from that, and we started finding we had a lot of red-tailed hawks and golden eagles showing up, and we drew a whole bunch of enthusiastic volunteers. The project is run by the Delaware Otsego Audubon Society on their wildlife sanctuary, and we have a group of very dedicated volunteer counters who are present pretty much every dry day, September, October, November, and any day that you can tolerate the weather in December.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as the temperatures get colder, I'm sure the volunteers will taper off.
Yeah.
Can you describe the importance of data collected from Franklin Mountain HawkWatch and other HawkWatch sites, and how is this data used, and what types of questions can this data answer? I know you touched on it briefly about the trail cameras and looking at the GPS tagging with all your photographs as well. But could you provide a little bit more detail on that?
A hawk migration site that's been operating under a consistent protocol for a long period of time gives a very good indication of what's going on in terms of the number of raptors that are migrating past the site. And for any one year, there can be dramatic changes. There's a lot of things can affect how raptors move. Weather is a really critical factor. The thing is, you need a fairly long data set to be seeing these changes in migration numbers. What they mean isn't necessarily that the population is changing. We're actually seeing a decrease in the number of red-tailed hawks, but all other indices on red-tailed hawks show that the population is not dropping. So something's going on there. There's also been similar observations about sharp-shinned hawks, where sharp-shinned hawk numbers are dropping at hawk watches, but not necessarily the population. So it may be that these birds are staying further north. It may be that they're hanging out at bird feeders. We're not sure. The data is also used for determining where hawks are migrating, their actual paths. They're used to assess wind project risk, which is something we've been involved in. I mentioned that it's sometimes difficult. There's confounding things in terms of determining populations and linking populations to hawk migration numbers, but the hawk migration numbers are used for gauging population numbers. There's a project called the Raptor Population Index, RPI, and there are some other efforts to determine for individual species what the numbers are.
Terrific. So looking at the Franklin Mountain HawkWatch area, what specific features of the site make it a particularly productive place to observe the fall migration of raptors?
Well, to understand that, I want to just briefly mention that the birds we see, many of, are birds that are using lift and flying in an efficient manner. There are different flight strategies birds use, and the birds we get the most of, which are buteos and eagles, don't want to flap their wings a lot. They want to soar and glide. So the two main ways to get lift for soaring and gliding are orographic lift, which is winds hitting geographic features and causing uplift, and thermals, which is the uneven heating of the ground and bubbles of hot air rising up, and the birds will get in those bubbles of hot air. So at Franklin Mountain, we have a series of long ridges, not exceptionally long, not like 100 miles long like they have at Hawk Mountain, but we have a series of 20 to 30 mile ridges that converge right at Franklin Mountain. And if you look at a topographic map, it's basically the upper Susquehanna watershed from the Unadilla River east to the Charlotte Creek. So the golden eagles and red-tailed hawks and some of the other large soaring raptors tend to use those ridges under very specific weather conditions. And those weather conditions are moderate northwest winds that are hitting those ridges at about 90 degrees. So the ridge that Franklin Mountain's on, a northwest wind hits it at 90 degrees, and it provides lift for birds going southwest in the fall and going northeast in the spring, because the migration parallels the coast. It's not due north and due south. So the other soaring lift is thermal lift, and we get a fair number of broadwing hawks, but that is dependent on sun hitting the ground, warming the air unevenly, and those birds, it's more of a crapshoot with broadwing hawks. The ridge puts them near us. With broadwing hawks, they can be anywhere. They can find thermals somewhere else. So.
Very good. Next question we have is, what are the most abundant species observed migrating past Franklin Mountain HawkWatch during the fall? And what is the typical timing of each of these species? And what weather conditions generally facilitate the movement of these species past the site?
Well, the species that we get the most of on average is red-tailed hawks, which I mentioned numbers have been somewhat less in recent years, but we do average about 1,600 red-tailed hawks a year. And their peak is usually late October, the last week of October, or the first week in November. And they use the orographic lift primarily. They will follow the ridge. And on a perfect day, they seem to be flying in single file, like beak to tail, somebody once called it. The second most numerous species we get is broadwing hawks, and we average about 1,200 a year. And as I mentioned, they tend to use thermal lift, and their peak is in mid-September. They're flying right now. Some of especially the younger birds are moving. Their numbers will be going up to around the middle of September. And we've had some dramatic days. We've had some really big days with over 1,000 broadwing hawks, but we also will sometimes have a year with very few, with 500 or 600. So those are the two most popular species.
Perfect. And I know the next question I have kind of correlates to that, and we already discussed the most popular species, which was the red-tailed hawks, the broad-winged. As other bird watchers come to the site, what other species of birds are they interested in coming to see? And I know, you touched on the red-tailed hawk and the broad-wings, but any bird watchers or bird enthusiasts, would you say, come to see the golden eagles and other species of that nature?
Yeah, golden eagles are the big draw.
Yeah.
That is what Franklin Mountain is most well known for, and that's why most people travel to Franklin Mountain. And Franklin Mountain has the single highest count of golden eagles in the eastern United States. There's 128 in one day. It was an exceptional day in many ways. First of all, it was very early in the year. This was in 2018, and the golden eagles, our tracked golden eagles showed up weeks early. The migration was early, and during that year, we learned later that the weather conditions in northern Quebec were extremely winter-like in October, and there had been a drought all summer. So, people suppose that it was a weather and scarcity of food event that caused these birds to come down, and the weather just happened to be particularly great on October 25th, 2018, and 128 came through. It was somewhat unbelievable. I wasn't there, but I checked my email at the end of the day, and I thought this must be a mistake, because I think the second highest count we ever had was 71, and that was an incredible number. There's no sites this far north that get golden eagles like Franklin Mountain. There's several sites in southwest of us, a couple hundred miles southwest of us in Pennsylvania. Allegheny Front, Wagner's Gap are the other two big golden eagle sites in the east. And they get similar numbers. I think Wagner's Gap generally gets more than us in a year. So we get good numbers of visitors through the season, though, it's not just golden eagles. We get good numbers during broadwing season. People particularly like to show up in September because the weather's nice. And broadwing hawks fly on reasonably nice days. It helps to have a little bit of a slight north wind, but the conditions for broadwing hawks being thermals, you don't want strong winds because they break up the thermals. The thermals to form, we need very light winds or almost still conditions. The birds will go up in those bubbles of air as high as they can, and then they'll stream off. So.
Good. So I know you kind of just touched on this question as well, but when is typically the best time of the season to see the highest diversity of raptors migrating past Franklin Mountain HawkWatch during the fall migration on a great day? I know you touched on the one big example was the golden eagle, 128 in one given day. How many species could you expect to see during this time of year on a good day?
Well, for the highest diversity, it would be generally the first week of October, from the very end of September before the middle of October. At that point, you're getting the early species and the later species kind of overlapping each other. And it's not uncommon if weather conditions are good the first week of October to get 10 species in a day. I know there's been a couple of 12 species days, and we include turkey vultures. Vultures are not raptors in terms of, technically they're not raptors, but traditionally they're considered raptors. They were counted as raptors at hawk migration sites, and they still are. Yeah, I would say if you want to see the highest numbers of species in the day, not the highest number of birds, you would aim for the first week of October.
Perfect. And our final question we have for you today is what advice would you give to students that want to improve their hawk watching skills and or volunteer at a local hawk watch site either in New York or their respective home states? I know you talked about some analysis on some of the photographs and stuff over the years, but anything that a student might perhaps an undergraduate standpoint want to gain some experience in hawk watch and the hawk identification and also volunteering at a site?
Well, first, they should be aware that all these volunteer sites appreciate help. And you don't have to have a good skill set to show up. You just have to be able to spot birds in the sky. It's a big sky, and when conditions aren't ideal, birds can be all over that sky. When conditions are ideal, the birds tend to fly in a very narrow path along the ridge. But that doesn't happen every day. There's a lot of days when there's birds flying, good numbers of birds flying, and they're all over, and the counters can use help spotting birds. So that is a skill that's really appreciated at volunteer hawk watches. If you want to come and you want to learn to identify hawks and you want to participate at a higher level, it would be really good to show up with at least some basic ID knowledge. You don't have to be able to identify every hawk, but if you can tell hawks by their silhouette, at least the genus of hawks, if you can tell a buteo from an accipiter, from a falcon, and maybe from an eagle, that is a really good start. You might want to look at a book. I have a book here. This is Hawks in Flight. It looks to me like it's mirror image on the screen. But this is a book that I picked up in the early 90s and found incredibly valuable. It is not a field guide. It explains to you the difference in how birds move, the difference in how birds appear in the sky, and it helps you understand how to identify a hawk in a different way from how most birders identify birds. You don't have this bird in your binoculars sitting on a branch where you can look at the different field marks, you can look at the plumage. Most of the time, you're not seeing a lot of color. You're not seeing much in the way of field marks. You might see where the wings are translucent, or you might see the shape of this bird, the profile of this bird in the sky. And hawk watchers learn to identify birds using a whole different set of information from a typical, say, Peterson field guide method of identifying birds. I would say if you're going to hawk watch and you really want to pursue it and you're interested, ask questions. If there's a lot of people there, there's going to be other skilled hawk watchers there. Frequently, especially if it's busy, the hawk counter is not going to have time to chat with you. If it's slow, hawk counter is going to be a great reference. It can be a great way of learning things. But if you distract them from what they're doing, it can be a problem. So, but yeah, I would say show up, ask questions. Don't be shy about saying, I see a bird in the sky. And even if they've already seen it, better that it not be missed.
Perfect. So on behalf of myself and Dr. Massey, we thank you, Tom, for speaking to our class today for wildlife management. And what I'll do for you guys' class is I'll actually provide the map to kind of show you the area and the actual birding list, so you can see all the species that Tom had mentioned, and also see other species that are pretty common at the Franklin Mountain HawkWatch site. And with that, thank you very much, Tom, and hopefully we can come out there and see you soon.
Thank you.